itu একটা informazione cucina Tasamiano
Why is this not working?
That's so much.
Dear professors and researchers, ladies and gentlemen, the Faculty of Economics, University of Kragujevac welcomes you at the 6th International Scientific Conference on Contemporary Issues in Economics, Business and Management, EBM 2020. EBM is a biennial scientific meeting that was first organized in 2010 with the objective of building research capabilities and thus improving the quality of research results in the fields of economics, business, and management. This year, for well-known reasons related to pandemic, the conference is organized online. My name is Diana Zlatanovic, and I'm going to be moderator at this session. As the president of the organizing committee, I have to say that it was very challenging to organize the conference in these circumstances. So it is our great pleasure that at the moment we have about 60 participants and about 20 listeners via YouTube. So today we are delighted to welcome our distinguished keynote speakers coming from renowned higher education institutions. Professor Natalie Van Meurs, Middlesex University, London, Great Britain. Professor Froystein Gestel, Norwegian School of Economics, Norway. And Professor Michael Frommel, Ghent University, Belgium. It is our great pleasure and honor to have such distinguished professors for keynote speakers. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and attending the conference. We also express our gratitude to the participants from our country and abroad. Our faculty owes special thanks to those participants from Poland, Slovenia, Russia, China, Ukraine, India, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Greece, and Portugal, but also participants from Serbian higher education institutions, such as the Faculty of Economics, University of Belgrade, Faculty of Economics, University of Niš, Faculty of Occupational Safety, University of Niš, Innovation Center, University of Niš, Faculty of Hotel Management and Tourism in Vrnjačka Banja, University of Kragujevac, State University of Novi Pazar, Department of Economic Sciences, Faculty of Technical Sciences, University of Kragujevac, and Faculty of Technical Sciences, University of Novi Sad, Faculty of Economics, Finance and Administration, Metropolitan University, Faculty of Economics and Informatics, City, Belgrade, and the Faculty of Economics, University of Kragujevac. Also, we would like to thank to the participants coming from other institutions in the Republic of Serbia, such as Association of Serbian Banks, Belgrade, and the Institute of International Politics and Economics, Belgrade. Now, I kindly ask the Dean of the Faculty of Economics, University of Kragujevac, Professor Petar Veselinovic, to welcome the conference participants.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, respected colleagues, on behalf of the Faculty of Economics, University of Kragujevac, it's my honor to welcome you and wish you successful work in your conditions caused by pandemic COVID-19. The reason for our gathering is the 6th in a row International Scientific Conference on Contemporary Issues in Economics, Business and Management, which is organized by the Faculty of Economics, University of Kragujevac. Today's conference was attended besides Serbian authors by the authors from numerous countries: Great Britain, Norway, Belgium, Russia, Poland, Ukraine, Slovenia, India, China, Greece, Bosnia and Herzegovina. I express my special gratitude to all authors who submitted their scientific works that will be presented at this conference. I wish everyone much success in work and of decision making. I declare the 6th International Scientific Conference, Contemporary Issues in Economics, Business and Management, open. Thank you.
Many thanks to the Dean. Now, let me invite today's host and the President of the Program Committee to welcome you and officially open the conference, Professor Violeta Domanovic.
Okay. Thank you, Diana. Can you hear me? I suppose you hear me. Dear professors, dear colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of Faculty of Economics, University of Kragujevac, and send my warmest welcome to all of you attending the online 6th International Scientific Conference entitled Contemporary Issues in Economics, Business and Management, IBM 2020. Since the year 2020 has been recognized as a really pandemic crisis year, it was really very hard to organize such a conference. Because of that, we organized it online, and I really wish to thank all of you who submitted the papers and made contributions to the conference. Firstly, I would like to thank to the keynote speakers, our distinguished professors, to Professor Natalie Van Meurs from Great Britain. Dear Professor, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and attending the conference. To Professor Dieter Frostein, whom I personally met in 2005. Dear Professor, thank you very much. And to Professor Michael Frommer from Belgium, thank you, Professor, very much too. The 43 papers submitted is a good indicator of this conference success in these pandemic conditions. Certainly, the most important issue nowadays is how to overcome difficulties caused by COVID-19. Since COVID-19 will certainly have a great and significant impact on our lives, as well as an economy, business, and management. Hence, as we have already expected, there are many papers which are focused on effects of COVID-19 on, for example, human capital assessment, digital competencies before and during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, consumer behavior trends during the coronavirus pandemic, pension insurance sector, workers in the Republic of Serbia, the perspectives of international trade in the Republic of Serbia in 2021, the concept of financial resilience in turbulent times, application of various relevant methods, models, and approaches, such as econometric and deep learning, investigation of factors explaining spread of COVID-19 across the countries, and so on. Now that we are gathered in Zoom communication platform, let us use this opportunity for further discussion on necessary changes in the field of management and marketing, globalization and regionalization, accounting and business finance, and finally, in the field of applied informatics and quantitative methods in economics and management. As we may expect, completely new business environment in 2021, managers must redesign their strategy and operating system so that they could react with more agility, creativity, and speed in order to face with such a situation. Today, we are going to try to compile the newest theoretical and empirical research results to provide a good background for a new economic era. In doing so, it is important to initiate different advanced thinking in management and marketing, which is the main topic of our first session, entitled The Key Issues in Management and Marketing. Then to reconsider the role of globalization and regionalization policy, which is our main topic in our second session, entitled Globalization and Regionalization. We consider new issues in accounting and business finance, and maybe to adjust some financial reporting models according to the new business environment conditions, which is the main topic of our third session entitled Accounting and Business Finance. And finally, but not the least important, the contrary, to think about new quantitative methods adjusted to the new business environment conditions, and that is our fourth session entitled Applied Informatics and Quantitative Methods in Economics and Management. I would like to point out something that you have already known, that good theory is a good base and good platform for a good practice, and that good researchers, good scientists always pose new questions, new issues, and face with new dilemmas, and envisage new problems and new solutions for resolving these problems, which would be a good start, a good base, and good platform for further research. Therefore, I believe that this conference will also be interesting and highly rewarding for all of you. Thank you, and welcome to the conference IBM 2020. I really do hope that the next conference will be held in better conditions. Thus, I use this opportunity to invite you to join us in next 2 years at the Faculty of Economics of the University of Kragujevac, but with new ideas, new opinions, new research results, new issues, new dilemmas, new problems, and new solutions for resolving such problems. Until then, I really wish you many very successful professional achievements and, at the first place, good health. I declare this conference open. Thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks to Professor Damanovic. Now we will proceed with the working part of the conference. As you can see in the program, the conference consists of the plenary and 4 parallel sessions. In order to start with the plenary session, let me invite our first keynote speaker, Professor Natalie Van Meurs, to address the audience. The title of her keynote speech is Navigating Uncertain Times, How Organizations Can Stimulate and Strengthen Innovation and Collaboration Among People. Professor Meurs, please share your presentation.
Thank you so much for this invitation. And I'm hoping that this will work. So I'm just going to share with you my... Does this work? Can I just check that you can see this?
Yes, yes.
Wonderful, thank you. So my name is Dr. not quite professor. Navigating uncertain times, how organizations can stimulate and strengthen innovation and collaboration among people. This is based on a larger project that we have been working on for a long time with people from all over the world. And when we started, we had no idea that we would end up in uncertain times together across the world. And even yesterday, in preparation for this keynote speech, I looked at the news and I thought, where are we just now? And of course, we see that at macro level, country level, countries are consistently having to make decisions on how to deal with the uncertainty that we're facing. And it's a balancing act because there are so many stakeholders that obviously governments are making decisions. We also know that organizations need to figure out a way to navigate this environment. And this will be something that we as academics can really truly make a contribution. We need to find a way to be not just in a conference space like this, which is wonderful to share ideas, but also to reach beyond and really make a contribution to this environment. So one of the examples that I want to highlight that really amplifies how we can learn from each other is this one keynote that I listened to on YouTube from Galton, and this was for the European Central Bank in 2019. And one of the threats then was, for instance, how banks who are in the business of credit and debt are facing new ways of working. There are lenders who are not the conventional banks. And so banks need to make a decision. And how can they do that? They can choose to walk. They can, for instance, leave a macro environment with too many regulations because they feel that that is unfair and that they cannot survive that way. And so in this screen grab, you can see the green names that are the new people on the block who are disrupting the banking environment. But of course, since then, a lot has happened. And one of the things that we are facing in the UK is, of course, Brexit. And a lot of organizations, including banks, are making the decision to also leave. But in this case, because there are too few rules, there is not enough regulation in relation to the status of the UK in the European community. So what I want to talk about today is our project that looks at uncertainty at a macro level, and then what organizations can do in terms of rules and procedures to clarify this world and what kind of impact that has on individuals. One of my favorite sayings is, what is normal for the spider is chaos for the fly. And so we need to look at our environments and say, okay, what is normal? What are norms? And how do they influence people's perception of the world? So the title of the paper that we published in the Journal of International Business Studies is, does organizational formalization facilitate voice and helping organizational citizenship behaviors? It depends on national uncertainty norms. So we're looking at uncertainty, at what organizations do, and how that then impacts employees who engage in collaboration and voicing innovative ideas. And so what was our objective when we started this paper? We wanted to explore the impact of organizational and national factors on employee behavior, because what happened before was that people who worked and who were helping each other and coming up with innovative ideas, usually that was explored from a more individual level perspective. What kind of personality did these people have? So our contribution is to say, okay, we think that the larger context has an influence. National differences have an influence. And if that is the case, the management idea that there is a one-size-fits-all solution to problems may not actually apply. So once again, the objective was to examine the joint influence of organizational formalization and national uncertainty on organizational citizenship behavior to deepen our understanding of when and how culture matters in international business. Why does this matter? It matters because we do not operate in a cultural vacuum, and organizations need to adapt to this uncertain world. We need all the help that we can get, and if we have our employees on board through voicing and collaboration, then this is a good thing. And I got this quote from Mark Carney, who is the ex-Bank of England governor. Trust arrives on foot, but leaves in a Ferrari. If the experience of the financial and COVID crisis teaches us anything, it's humility. We cannot anticipate every risk or plan for every contingency, but we can and must plan for failure. And we need to do that collaboratively within the organization. And like I said, this conference too is an opportunity for us to reach out to each other and learn from each other. Now, I know that there are a lot of talented upcoming scholars in the audience and listening on YouTube. And so I wanted to reach out to you and be entirely transparent about what happened behind the scenes. It is so often that we read a paper in a good journal or we listen to a presentation and it seems so effortless. And I can assure you that this is not the case. It requires hard work and sometimes the path is not so straightforward. So I just wanted to share with you that when we started this work and we wrote the paper, we began with a submission to AMJ, a very good journal, and we were invited to revise and resubmit, which was wonderful. We sent it to their annual meeting, the Academy of Management 2016 meeting. The paper was the winner of the Best Accepted Paper in AOM program. It was also the winner of the Best Paper with International Implications. And it was nominated for the Caroline Dexter Award, which is also Best International Paper. So we took on this feedback. We were delighted with the result and we resubmitted to AMJ. It didn't work. We got a reject. And we therefore needed to rethink our path. At this junction, I am again totally transparent. Many of the co-authors who we worked with across the globe were done. They were like, you know, we are happy with the results so far. So it was left to me and the lead of this project, Dr. Ronald Fisher, to work together and say, okay, what are we going to do? We really needed to listen to the feedback. And although the idea that we were looking at a macro level influence on organizational practices that has an influence on individuals, the key feedback was, okay, but why? Why is this happening? And so we needed to think through our idea. And first of all, I want to focus on the key aspect that was important in our focus. So organizational citizenship behavior is central to modern businesses. And the two particular behaviors that are important are voice and helping, because they allow for more efficient and smooth functioning of the organization and for more innovation and creativity. So it's something that modern organizations want to foster. Helping is the relationships between others, and voice is speaking up with suggestions for change, challenging work routines, and acting on your own initiative. But although it's essential for organizations to thrive, it can be risky. And we all know stories about whistleblowers, that they perhaps are fired. Just in some cases, even there are legal issues. And in the worst case scenario, they are overlooked for promotion. So organizational citizenship behaviors only flourish in certain kind of environments. And what kind of environments are those? Now, conventionally, in organizations, the idea was the more formalizations, rules and regulations, the less employee freedom. So if you constrain people's ability to engage in discretionary behavior, you're risking alienating them. They may walk, they may leave, or they become dysfunctional in the organization. They're not motivated anymore. That was the conventional idea. And so we needed to come up with a really good reason why we thought that formalization could be a good thing. Now, there is some research that says that formalization actually enables efficiency in production, right? So it helps to overcome role ambiguity. It allows people to understand better what is expected of them. So there is this tension. As I started this keynote also, rules can be a good thing, but they can also be a bad thing, depending on what is necessary. And also, it depends on the larger macro level environment, the kind of challenges that you face in the wider environment. So we know that institutional, political, and economic forces shape our everyday practices. If anything, COVID-19 has really shown that what is happening at macro level means that people and organizations need to be agile, need to be adapt to new ways of working. And uncertainty really affects working negatively because it is cognitively tasking for our brain. It reduces our feelings of control. And when we have not that sense of control, it means that we're less likely to engage in what's called discretionary behavior. So people, on the one hand, like this openness and not too many rules, but on the other hand, they prefer certainty about how to behave and what to expect. And this is important because it's linked to social survival. The idea, in essence, was that organizational formalization has a compensatory effect on organizational citizenship behavior. And this depends on the level of national uncertainty. But again, we really needed to think of the theoretical underlying reason for this. And this is because we were invited to consider what is it that makes us as humans tick to behave in a certain way. Because we perceive the world, and even during COVID-19, it's indicated that, yes, on the one hand, the science can tell us one thing, but it's also about how people perceive, because the way people perceive the world is then how they're going to behave. And so normative perceptions play a crucial role in understanding how contextual features influence work behavior. This is basically related to this idea that we can then function on certain autopilots. We understand the way things are done here within the organization, within the nation. And when we understand how things are done here, we can then maybe engage in more extra role behavior, helping each other, voicing ideas. So our hypotheses in a nutshell are that formalization can facilitate OCB in countries with high uncertainty because it frees up cognitive resources and it reduces levels of anxiety. But on the other hand, if you are operating in an environment with low uncertainty, and let's face it, at the moment, where is that in the world? But let's hope that we're going to get there one day. Then employees will have sufficient cognitive resources, and they will then engage in organizational citizenship behavior. And in that case, formalization can actually be constraining. So what did we do? We sampled 7,537 employees from over 250 organizations across 17 countries. And the list of countries is here, and it's a wide range. But again, for the sake of transparency, many times when you're doing cross-cultural research, this really depends on your network and who you can work with. So yes, the range of countries has a theoretical meaning, but on the other hand, you also need to be able to just get the data. We targeted medium and large organizations that represent typical employers in a particular region. And then we controlled for several variables, and we found that not many change any of the main findings reported. And I will go into more details of these control variables and their impact, because it has an impact also for our future research. So this is then a table with the sample. On the left-hand side, you can see the range of countries, how many people we were able to sample in each country. The average age was about 35, and the percentage of men in among the respondents also varies per country. Similarly, the percentage of managerial responsibility, which we used as a covariate, also varies across countries. Now, it's often that we look at data from a country, but it's useful to know what the main point of collection was. And this is because, of course, for certain particularly large countries, but maybe also small countries, regional differences matter. And when you get data from a city, it's very different from another city. So in a visual then, to explain what we did, we asked respondents about their country, about their uncertainty avoidance. We asked them about their work practices, what are the rules and policies, what are the procedures, and we asked about their behavior. So what was our analysis? Our analysis was a 3-level model. And the first key item that we looked at was perceived uncertainty. So we adopted 4 items measuring normative perceptions of nation-level uncertainty. And an example item would be, most people lead highly structured lives with few unexpected events. There was the typical rating scale. Now, what we also did was to just check that we were on the right track with our uncertainty measure. We took 6-component measure of the governance efficiency of the World Bank. So we took information from the World Bank for each of the 17 countries that we sampled by looking at 6 aspects, such as, for example, level of corruption, adherence to the rule of law. And we then made one variable, and then we correlated that with our own data. And as you can see, it's a good correlation. Now, what is interesting about this particular item, and I'm just going to show you the next slide, is that we thought it was fascinating to see that when we looked at our countries, the countries that we sampled, and on the y-axis here, you can see the level of certainty, and on the x-axis, you can see over time. We were just interested to see this difference. So at the top, you can see countries that were relatively certain, and at the bottom, you can see countries that were relatively uncertain. Now, the vertical lines were just for our reference, 2000. We were interested to see what happened. It was, approximately around the time that the World Trade Center attacks happened. 2004 was when we started the project. And 2008, of course, was the economic crisis. We certainly think that future research should look at what has happened since, in 2020, when we get that World Bank data. But what I want to again share with you is that when we originally submitted this, we wanted to include it in a more prominent way in the paper. And the reviewer said, no, leave it out. Now, I always thought that triangulation was a good thing, but it just goes to show that when you contribute a paper, you're contributing to a wider discussion, and you are just one piece of the puzzle. You can't include everything. So you need to remain focused on your specific message. So then, what did we look at in terms of organizational items? We adapted 5 formalization items from previous research. And an example item is, the jobs are performed according to previously defined procedures. And again, it was on a rating scale from never to always. Individual items, helping and voice. And examples were, this particular coworker volunteers to do things for his work group, or this particular coworker speaks up and encourages others in this group to get involved in issues that affect the group. Now, this was an original scale from Van Dien and Lepine from 1998. And what is interesting here is you must have noticed that it's not a self-reflection. And that's, of course, because when we evaluate ourselves in terms of helping and voice behavior, maybe we will give socially desirable answers. So all of our items at individual, organizational, and national level are the participants, the respondents' observations. They are the perceived norms. We controlled for age and managerial position. We didn't find any gender differences. We, at organizational level, controlled for organization-based support. An item would be, for example, employees are supported by their superior. Now, this is a really important variable. It's a strong predictor of organizational citizenship behavior. As you can imagine, if you feel support, you might engage in extra role behavior. We also controlled for industry at organizational level. And finally, at national level, we controlled for GNI, and we also created a power distance variable made up of Hofstede, Schwarz's, and the globe data that was available. What were our results? Well, first, the descriptive statistics table. And as you can see here, voice and helping, which is our main focus, they correlate with the variables such as managerial responsibility, formalization, employee support, the control variable, and uncertainty. So we knew that there was something going on that was interesting. So the results then were exactly what we anticipated. The effect of formalization is stronger in contexts of higher uncertainty norms and is weaker for lower uncertainty norms. And for voice, this was quite a strong effect. However, for helping, the interaction was in the predicted direction, but it was only marginally significant. Now, the organizational support, as I said, turned out to be quite an important variable. It showed a strong and positive effect on both helping and voice. So greater organizational support is associated with increased levels of organizational citizenship behavior. Then, most crucially, this interaction effect of uncertainty on formalization on voice remains significant when controlling for variables. And like I said, the interaction effect was for helping was in the predicted direction. So here is the table then, if you're interested in the levels and you're a hugely quantitative person. What is important is to see at the different levels the entry of formalization, uncertainty, and then the interaction of formalization and uncertainty on voice on the left and on helping to the right. And as you can see, particularly for voice, this is significant. This is then the graph. So what you can see here on the y-axis is the level of voice, and then of level of formalization at the x-axis. And then you can see this cross of the lines. So for if uncertainty is high, you've got the highest score in this analysis, then it is up. So in high uncertainty environments with high formalization, people voice their opinions, they share ideas, they criticize their work practices. Whereas we did not find that significant effect for uncertainty low. Discussion. Organizations operating in an uncertain macro level environment benefit from clearly specified rules and procedures to foster voice and helping OCB. And so here we contribute to the puzzle that is already existing, the discussion that is already going on about formalization and uncertainty. And so we really argue that we need to do more levels of analysis because it can really contribute to the wider picture. We also think that it contributes to the conventional idea in management that formalization is a bad thing. And we can now think of more nuanced ways of applying the idea that formalization could actually be beneficial, depending on how you operate. And I'm going to talk more about that in the practical implications. The theoretical implications are that our research provides one specific case study which demonstrates these effects on OCB, and that shared normative perceptions are important for statistically predicting OCB. This is an important avenue for future further research as businesses move into national contexts that are culturally, economically, and institutionally different from Western societies. Practical implications are that if you are a manager or a leader of an organization, and let's face it, we're now all operating in an uncertain environment, maybe you want to consider how you can employ better rules and regulations to calm things down, to perhaps be that buffer between an uncertain environment. And that could be an environment that is facing COVID, but of course also facing the UK, facing financial issues, and facing the threat of the demise of our planet. What is important, though, is that managers and leaders should not micromanage and be coercive. The limitation of our research was that we did not match organizations across cultures. And this increases the error variance at the organizational and national level, reducing the likelihood of significant findings. But then the fact that we did find significant results is meaningful. We also did not include individual difference variables in our study beyond the demographic control variables. So that's another avenue of future research. Further discussions, I'm just going to check the chat so that I'm sure that some interesting questions that I'm looking forward to maybe discussing later. But further discussion is that, okay, so we have a main contribution. However, then since then, Watts et al. Argued that transformational leadership may be beneficial specifically in uncertain environments. And this was published in the same journal. And they define transformational leadership as providing a positive, compelling vision of the future, role modeling idealized behaviors in pursuit of this vision, demonstrating individualized consideration, and providing intellectual stimulation. Does this mean that their paper is a contradiction to ours? No, I don't think so. I think you can be a transformational leader, but you can set some clear guidelines about how the business is operating. And then, as I said, we are currently working on a second paper where we're looking at this variable of organizational support and the impact that this has. So we're just hot off the press looking at the results of our data. And what we found so far is that employees who perceive that their organization supports them report higher procedural justice. Now, this is in itself seems quite logical, but this effect is stronger in low power distance and low paternalism contexts. So here we could potentially make a contribution about governance and government leadership. Should it be low and or high power distance and paternalism? I want to finish this keynote by saying that we as scholars together have a responsibility to reach out and communicate our results, because this world that is uncertain needs to have some kind of core theory and solid evidence that they can build a new world And as we together in this conference can really listen to each other and maybe go out of our zone of comfort, go out of our silos and listen to a talk that is slightly outside our field, so that we all together contribute one small part to the whole of the puzzle. Once again, I thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to listening to all the talks today, as many as possible, and for us to have some very fruitful discussions together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mers, for your extraordinary presentation and speech. Before we proceed, I would like to propose that to emphasize that you can ask the questions to our keynote speakers and or give comments via chat. And if I we have one question, but if you agree, I propose to leave discussion at the end of this session. And now let us proceed with the next presentation, which will be given by Professor Royston Gestel. He will share his insights on conceptual framework of accounting. Professor Gestel, please share your presentation.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks again for letting me speak at the EBM conference 2020. I had looked forward to visiting Serbia and meeting all of you in person, but I realized that this is the best we can do under the circumstances. I hope and trust that we can meet in the future. Allow me to invite the accounting scholars in the audience to attend the European Accounting Association Annual Congress in Bergen, Norway in May 2022. Hopefully, we are then back to normal. I will begin my talk by citing the well-known American economist, Lawrence Summers. A number of years ago, he is supposed to have said the following: the single most important innovation shaping the American capital market was the idea of generally accepted accounting principles. He added, we need something similar internationally. Accountants, like most people, enjoy feeling important, and I personally often cite Professor Summers to my MBA students. Some people may find the citation a bit over the top, and it may be worthwhile spending a few minutes reflecting on what Lawrence Summers might have meant by his words. I think we can all agree that information is of central importance in capital markets. The allocation of capital must be based on much relevant information as much as possible, of course, subject to cost-benefit considerations. Capital should not be allocated to investments that are not likely to generate sufficient returns. Bad business models and incompetent management should be rooted out. Investors should not be invited to channel their savings into projects with inefficient risk-return profiles. In short, in market economies, economic growth is heavily dependent on informed pricing of financial instruments. Fortunately, we live in the information society. Information is everywhere for those who has the ability to find it and use it effectively. Relevant information will concern individual companies, industries, as well as the economy as a whole. Development of technology and the environment is of crucial importance. Right now, information about the pandemic seems to be driving everything. Successful investing involves collecting and integrating all the different pieces of the puzzle. Financial statements convey information about individual companies, but they are not the only source of information about individual companies. In company reports, there is some, but not all that much information about industries and the economy. You may therefore think that the role of accounting information is diminishing over time, as competing sources of information is gradually taking over. There may be other reasons for predicting the demise of accounting as well. Many observers have noted that the accounting model is created for the industrial age, when companies invested in bricks and mortar and not intangible assets like research, development, and brand building. A recent bestseller by Lev and Gu, 2016, tells this story. The End of Accounting is the title of their book. Fortunately for financial accountants, this does not seem to be the whole story. A recent paper by Beaver et al. Studies the development of the information content of financial statements since the 1970s. If information is useful, it must affect market outcomes such as prices or trading volumes. Information content is a relative measure. It measures how much the variation in prices and volumes are due to information in companies' financial statements. Surprisingly, the information content has increased significantly to the right of the slide, at the very right when you see the blue curve going steeply upwards. This should indicate that finance is less important in the information age. Beaver et al. Seems to be surprised themselves by the evidence. It would be interesting to explain this phenomenon. Without further evidence, any attempt to offer explanation must necessarily be highly speculative. I think it's a fact that information of the information age is on average less reliable than before. Sorting out the facts from the spin and the fake news is hard work. At the same time, the market for informational intermediation is changing. Make it hard to make a living sell-side analyst. Trading fees can no longer be used to pay for financial analysis. The increasing popularity of index investing may imply that buy-side analysts may also face an uncertain future. We also know that rating agencies are not to be trusted. They have in the past been producers of fake news themselves. Newspapers are financially stressed and are cutting back. Thus, the supply of information intermediation is decreasing as the demand is increasing. This is a good example of the failure of markets for information. It's my personal opinion that audited financial statements are relatively clean. There have always been instances of financial information fraud. The user should always be skeptical rather than naive. But on the whole, financial statements may be trusted to provide reliable information. And not only that, the duty to provide auditing financial information enforces the discipline on the whole flow of entity-related information. Any attempt to put a positive spin on firm-related information will soon backfire. It's better to be prudent than risk losing trust in the financial markets. So we may conclude that financial accounting has an important and socially useful role to play. Historically, this has been the case, and there is no reason to expect changes at this basic level going forward. The next question I want to ask is likely to be more controversial. How well is the accounting industry or the accounting profession performing its function? Does the industry provide the financial markets with optimal information content in an efficient manner? For an academic, it may be natural to take a critical perspective. There is certainly enough to criticize. However, today I am in a friendly mood, and I want to argue that it's remarkable, even amazing that the financial accounting industry does as well as it actually does. The annual report is supposed to convey and explain the financial position and financial performance of large corporations in 50 to 100 pages in a way that the reader can understand with as little time and effort as possible. Imagining a company CEO sitting down with some blank pieces of paper in order to write an essay explaining what has happened during the preceding year without any guidance or directions with respect to form and content. Clearly, this would be an abject failure, a Christmas letter to investors. The resulting text would be close to useless, and the reader would struggle to glean any useful information from this narrative. Some standardization is obviously needed for financial reporting to work at all. This is where generally accepted accounting principles, or GAAP, comes in. GAAP, which these days are supported by accounting standards, provide a template that must be used for financial reporting. I think this is what Professor Summers alluded to when he spoke his flattering words about accounting. Today's wish for internationalization has also come true. Thanks to the International Accounting Standards Board, IASB, we may talk about international GAAP. In fact, today I may download English language financial statements for foreign corporations and read them just as easily as domestic ones. Some people like to talk about GAAP as a language. All communication requires a common language. In Norway, we are bilingual. We have international GAAP for listed companies and Norwegian GAAP for everyone else. It's important to realize that the language is not only a means to communicate, it also determines subject matter. The what as well as the how of communication. You cannot talk about anything if you don't have the words. Personally, I'm fond of the map metaphor of accounting. A roadmap is much simpler than a map used for orienteering. A former student of mine is now the editor-in-chief of one of the country's largest newspapers. She once stated in an interview that as a student, she always disliked financial statement analysis. This is probably a testament to my teaching abilities. At the fundamental level, accounting and journalism is not that different. At this point, I think it's interesting to contrast financial reporting and sustainability reporting. I'm not an expert on sustainability reporting, but I sense that sustainability reporting is experiencing a breakout moment. Thus far, ESG reporting has been a little like the CEO with her blank sheets. The CSO, in this case, has been given a number of pages to tell her story, and they all do it in their own way, and the reader has trouble making sense of it all. The charge of greenwashing keeps coming up. Corporations are accused of framing the issues as they see fit, not necessarily telling the whole truth, so to speak. The demand for generally accepted sustainability principles, GASP, we may say, is increasing. There are at the moment a large number of organizations that have declared their candidacy for International Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Just recently, the IASB has issued a consultation document on sustainability reporting, in fact, indicating their readiness to issue standard in this area as well. At this point, it must be decided what is the core competence. Is it competence in standard setting in general or competence in the relevant subject area? Here, the area is environmental science rather than financial accounting. Non-core expertise may, in any case, be hired from the outside. After this lengthy introduction, I will talk about standard setting in financial reporting. I will concentrate on conceptual issues. The focus will be on the IASB's conceptual framework for financial reporting that has recently been revised after a long and very contentious process. I will concentrate on the more general aspects of the framework and spend less time on the more specific accounting-related issues. Although I was involved in the process as a co-writer of responses to several consultation documents for more than one organization, I shall not have much to say about the process and the attendant controversy. For this, I will refer to Erb and Pegler 2015. They provide an excellent analysis of parts of the process. For my own part, I recognize the frustrations of the earliest stages of the process, but the IASB must be given a lot of credit for the way they completed the project. The final framework is much more consensus-driven and a much more consensus-driven document, for better or for worse. So what is the conceptual framework for financial reporting? The International Accounting Standards Board, as well as the US Financial Accounting Standards Board, FASB, have issued a large number of accounting standards on separate reporting issues. The FASB had learned from its predecessor, the Accounting Principles Board, that some of the same issues arose in different standards. To arrive at inconsistent solutions would not be good and leave the board open to criticism. In any case, it would be efficient to solve some of the pervasive issues once and for all and avoid having the same debate over and over again. The idea behind the conceptual framework project, this was the idea behind the conceptual framework project. The first concept statement was published in 1978, followed by several others, and essentially finished by 1985. The IASB issued its framework in 1989. This framework was written in British English, but otherwise heavily influenced by the FASB version. Several other countries completed their own similar frameworks. This was the first round of frameworking, the first generation of conceptual frameworks. The second round started in 2002 when the FASB and the IASB agreed to cooperate. The objective was to converge the two main sets of accounting frameworks. A revision of the conceptual frameworks was put near the top of their agenda. The Enron scandal and other accounting scandals around that time provided strong internal and external pressure for reform. The first stage was completed in 2010 with the publication of a partially revised conceptual framework for financial reporting 2010. At this point, the Americans pulled out and the IASB completed the project on its own. The final framework was published in March 2018. The 2018 framework included changes to the revisions of 2010. Before going on to discuss the conceptual framework in more detail, it's important to note the following facts about the role of the framework. The framework is primarily used for the standard setters in order to produce consistent, high-quality accounting standards. However, the standard setter is free to override the framework at any time, and the standards themselves have priority. In this sense, the framework is not like a constitution, which cannot be violated by legislation. The producers of financial reports may consult the framework when issues cannot be resolved by relevant accounting standards. In any case, the framework is not designed to solve practical problems and is unlikely to be of much help to producers. Finally, an objective of the framework is to assist in understanding and interpreting standards. The conceptual framework may help legitimize accounting standards and the standard setting process. So let me explain a little bit about the structure of the conceptual frameworks for financial reporting. The new and the older frameworks have basically the same structure. It's visualized as a pyramid, where the reasoning flows from the top to the bottom. The top two layers of the pyramid concern general purpose financial reporting. We are supposed to start by defining the purpose of the reports. From this, it will be possible to derive some necessary qualitative characteristics of the information. To decide on objectives and qualitative characteristics seems to be a natural starting point for any reporting framework. It seems reasonable to suggest that non-financial reporting should also be subject to a similar procedure. The remaining layers of the pyramid deals more narrowly with financial statements. Financial statements include the statements of financial position, also called a balance sheet, the statement of financial performance, also called the income statement, and other statements and notes. Those financial statements include supplementary footnote disclosure as well. And in layer 3, the reporting entity and the reporting period is defined. In layer 4, the most important elements of the financial statements, such as assets, liabilities, equity, revenues, and expenses, are discussed in great detail. Recognition 5, layer 5, deals, recognition in the layer 5 deals with the statement of financial position and the statement of financial performance. To be included in these statements, i.e. recognized, an element must satisfy the definition of an element as well as some further conditions. Then in layer 6, measurement is finally addressed. Should recognized elements be measured at historical cost or some variant of current value, fair value, value in use, or current cost? Previous conceptual frameworks have mostly listed the available measurement attributes. The current framework also provides criteria to be used to determine which attribute is preferable in a specific case. It's implicit that financial statements should be based on a mixed model in which different measurement attributes are used at the same time. The final layers, presentation and disclosure, concepts of capital and capital maintenance, are currently underdeveloped. Some important issues are left for future work. I noted earlier that the conceptual framework projects have been very controversial in this century as well as in the previous century. The objectives have been fiercely debated, the qualitative characteristics as well. The definitions of the elements are certainly controversial. However, the measurement issue is by far the issue on which opinions have been most divided. Unlike the other issues, measurement has enormous practical consequences for users, producers, and auditors alike. Some observers have wondered if the measurement controversy is not a driving force behind all the other controversies. See, for example, Urban Pegler, 2015. When we discussed the objectives of financial reporting and the qualitative characteristics, we are really discussing whether fair value is superior to historical cost. If someone, for example, argues that verifiability is an important characteristic of financial information, what they may really be saying is that they are in favor of historical cost. Conversely, proponents of current value would like to place verifiability at the bottom of the list of characteristics in order to favor their own preferred measurement alternative. If Erb and Pegler's charge is true, the pyramid is turned upside down. The argument does not proceed from the top to the bottom, but rather from measurement and upwards. Intellectually, this would be a deplorable state of affairs. In the following, the measurement issue will be ignored, running the risk of disregarding the only issue of any importance. I will address the objective as well as the qualitative characteristics and conclude with some remarks on the definitions of the elements. By the conceptual framework, I will in the following refer to the 2018 framework of the International Accounting Standards Board. I think it's good to start by pointing out that information is an economic good. It's a public good, as it may be consumed and then passed on to another consumer without necessarily losing value. But in any case, there must be a demand for the information. By this, I mean that someone must be willing to pay something for the information. In the conceptual framework, these persons are called the users. The user perspective has been integral to standard setting since around 1970. The conceptual framework then goes on to identify the primary user group and more specifically, as existing and potential investors, lenders, and other creditors. It's also interesting to note that the conceptual framework excludes unsophisticated users. Users must have a reasonable knowledge of business and economic activities and review and analyze the information diligently. From a stakeholder perspective, this may seem overly restrictive. In many countries, financial statements are public information, and the potential user group is much larger than investors. On the other hand, the IASB points out that information useful for investors may be useful for other groups as well. To focus on the main user groups may be necessary to derive meaningful standards. Personally, I do not have any problems with that. However, authorities should be aware of the fact that some user groups may not be served by the standard setter and may require special attention. Finally, it's necessary to ask what users do with information. This is where the controversy arose. According to the conceptual framework, information is used in decision-making relating to providing resources to the entity. Specifically, decisions involving A, buying, selling, or holding equity and debt instruments, B, providing or settling loans and other forms of credit, or C, exercising rights to vote on or otherwise influence actions that affect the use of the entity's economic resources. Bullet point C includes corporate governance and control of management, in addition to capital market transactions. In financial accounting, the agency relationships are denoted by the slightly archaic term stewardship. Stewardship, the concept as well as the term, has lived dangerously over the years. Many people would have wished to get rid of bullet point C. It has been argued that bullet point C is unnecessary because it's implicit in A and B. A slightly different argument is that C is not needed because the ranking of information is not affected by C. In other words, the optimal information for A and B is also optimal for C. I have argued elsewhere that the latter argument is false. I will try to use a simple example to illustrate. Assume you invest in an index fund in an efficient market. An index fund has no management, just a computer selecting portfolios of stocks that mimic the market portfolio. At the end of the period, the only thing you want to know is the market value of the portfolio. The market value is valuable information for your consumption investment decision going forward, but past returns does not matter. If you finish the period with 1,000, it's not important if you started with 500 or 2,000. In particular, in an efficient market, the future returns are independent of historical returns. Now consider actively managed funds instead. In this case, you want to evaluate the performance of management. For this purpose, the annual return is relevant information. It's important to know how much you invested originally. If the return is negative, the annual bonus is probably out of the question, and a change of management all the more likely. In the classical literature, there are similar arguments. Payton and Littleton, 1940, asked why a company may want to report extraordinary or unusual items. By definition, such items are irrelevant for future enterprise performance. For an evaluation of managerial performance, on the other hand, such information may be relevant, reflecting good or bad decisions by management. The campaign to suppress stewardship has been puzzling and has taken some extreme forms. I remember attending an investors conference in London where a representative of the IASB had been invited to speak. This must have been when the board was putting its finishing touches on the 2010 version of the conceptual framework. In his talk, he mentioned that the term stewardship would not be used in the new framework. It had been decided that this was an English term that was very hard to translate into other languages. My first reaction was utter disbelief. How could they expect to get away with such an argument? Translation may be a non-trivial business, but the business that may be safely entrusted to the native speakers. Moreover, stewardship is mentioned in the Holy Bible. And that document has been translated into most languages. In any case, stewardship is used 8 times in chapter 1 of the 2018 version of the conceptual framework. Amen. The real reason for fighting stewardship may be that it sometimes has been associated with historical cost. Information about past actions, such as transactions, may involve historical cost. On the other hand, outcomes are also relevant for performance evaluation. In the portfolio management example mentioned above, no one would consider using historical cost for performance measurement. Current portfolio values and returns are the only meaningful measures, and as long as stock prices are quoted in active markets, the information is readily available. Divergent opinions on the role of stewardship may also be due to differences in corporate governance. In Europe, investors may be more directly involved in governance, for example, at annual meetings, than is common in the United States. So then I will go on to talk about qualitative characteristics. In the first generation of conceptual frameworks, the fundamental qualitative characteristics were relevance and reliability. Relevance is an intuitive concept and easily explained. Some states of the world or real-world phenomena might influence decisions if they were known. If the Center for Disease Control had known how the virus is transmitted, more effective measures for preventing infections would have been taken much earlier. We may say that such states of the world are decision relevant and that information about such states is relevant information, even if it is incomplete. The connection between information usefulness and information relevance is fairly obvious. Some would say trivial. To conclude that irrelevant information is not useful does not require any deep thoughts. However, it's important to realize that relevance is really related to the underlying states of the world. There may not be any available information about these states that are useful. Materiality is another term that is used a lot by accountants and auditors. Materiality is a firm-specific variant of relevance. Some information may be relevant for most firms, but not all. Then the information is said to be immaterial for those other firms and does not have to be reported even if it's mandated by some standard. So relevance has not generated any controversy. The second characteristic, on the other hand, generated a serious conflict between the accounting standards boards and their constituencies, a conflict that could easily have threatened their very existence. In the 2010 conceptual framework, reliability was replaced by faithful representation. This action was met with almost unanimous opposition among the respondents to the consultation document. To most respondents, the boards replaced a perfectly well understood concept by one that no one seemed able to explain. The boards accused constituents of being ignorant and seemed to give up any attempt to clarify the meaning of this important term. Faithful representation is also used in the 2018 framework, but here the term has been explained in a way that makes it more palatable to constituents. So is this just an academic debate about terminology, or are there some fundamental differences of opinion here? Urban Pegler 2015 notes that the same or similar underlying ideas have been described by different terms over the years. In their opinion, verifiable best captures this idea. Earlier, dependable and objective were much used. Reliable was introduced by Algeri and Jadiki in 1967, And Kinsadal 2007 attributes faithful representation to sterling. See, for example, sterling 1983. Other terms are precise and accurate. You might also throw in true and fair view for good measure. Recently, objective has made a comeback. See, for example, the IASB Fair Value Standard, IFRS 13. In the first generation conceptual framework, reliability was defined as verifiability and faithful representation. In the new conceptual framework, reliability has been replaced by faithful representation and verifiability has been relegated to enhancing qualitative characteristic, nice to have, but not strictly necessary. The meaning of faithful representation may have changed too, but let us concentrate on what faithful representation is currently supposed to mean. Financial reports must also faithfully represent the substance of the phenomena that it purports to represent. The conceptual framework further explained, to be a perfectly faithful representation, a depiction would have three characteristics. It would be complete, neutral, and free from error. Kinsadal 2017 undertakes a conceptual inquiry into the meaning of complete, neutral, and free from error. The terms are briefly explained in the 2010 framework and explained in more detail in previous frameworks. She discovers circularity, inconsistency, and general vagueness. So let us not go there. If you allow me to suggest a more pragmatic interpretation, it might run something like this. No representation is complete, but an incomplete representation should not be biased in such a way that users are misled. It's very easy to mislead by providing a selective representation, also called errors of omission or spinning of the truth. Neutrality is also about information management. The objective of information is to influence decisions, but the standard setter or the carrier of information should not interfere in the information process to obtain a desired action. In my opinion, neutrality does not preclude conservatism or prudence. A prudent representation may be faithful if the application of prudence is understood by everyone. This also seems to be the current view of the IASB. Finally, errors should be minimized. Errors may be intentional or unintentional. Information systems should ideally minimize both the sources of unintentional as well as the opportunities for intentional errors. So I think the time is running. I guess I should speed up a little bit and maybe get to the conclusion. But I wanted to say that useful information about the firm may be almost anything. Kinsadal 2017 is careful to point out that conceptual frameworks should recover all conceivable possibilities. However, in financial reporting, information in the form of measurement is the most common. Valuation of assets and liabilities are examples of measurement. It's therefore important to consider how the qualitative characteristics works with respect to measurement. Assets may be valued at historical cost, fair value, value in use, or current cost. Level 6 of the conceptual framework deals with the choice of measurement attributes. The IASB explains how faithful representations should be used to decide about measurement. They introduce the concept of measurement, uncertainty, and uncertain estimate. To quote from the 2018 conceptual framework, chapter 222, in some cases, a trade-off between the fundamental qualitative characteristics may need to be made in order to meet the objective of financial reporting, which is to provide useful information about economic phenomena. For example, the most relevant information about the phenomenon may be a highly uncertain estimate. In some cases, the level of measurement uncertainty involved in making that estimate may be so high that it may be questionable whether the estimate would provide a sufficiently faithful representation of that phenomenon. In some cases, the most useful information may be the highly uncertain estimate, accompanied by a description of the estimate and an explanation of the uncertainties that affect it. In other cases, if that information would not provide a sufficiently faithful representation of that phenomenon, the most useful information may include an estimate of another type that is slightly less relevant, but is subject to lower measurement uncertainty. In limited circumstances, there may be no estimate that provides useful information. In those circumstances, it may be necessary to provide information that does not rely on an estimate. This type of argument seems much closer to the reasoning that is familiar from the earlier frameworks. Indeed, substituting reliability for faithful representation here will not change the meaning at all. On the other hand, it seems quite different from the 2010 version, where the idea of a trade-off between relevance and faithful representation was never mentioned, and where the ranking of qualitative characteristics seemed almost lexicographic. Relevance dominated, absolutely. To sum up, if my interpretation is correct, the changes made from 2010 to 2018 are more fundamental than is apparent at first glance. The big words have been retained in deference to previous boards, but their interpretation is quite different. More pragmatic and much closer to the first generation conceptual frameworks. Faithful representation is still there in the conceptual framework, but the board seems to say, but don't worry, it really means reliability. Note that most of the people that seem to be driving the conceptual framework project in the early 2000s are no longer involved. So I think that in order of saving time, I will skip the elements of the financial statement. I think it's good to stop there. So thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Gestel, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to hear such remarkable speech. And last but not least, we are honored to greet Professor Michael Frommel. He will share his insights on the crisis alpha of CTAs, the weathering financial storms. Professor Frommel, please share your presentation.
Yes, thank you. So let's share the presentation. First of all, I would like to state that it's an honor and a pleasure to do a keynote speech at this conference. I was very much looking forward to visiting Serbia, of course. Unfortunately, that didn't work this year, but I hope we can catch up another time. So I'm talking about something, well, we have now been talking about management in the first presentation. We have been talking about accountancy in the second presentation. We will now talk a little bit about investments. And the financial markets are, of course, also affected this year by the COVID-19 crisis as much as the conference. And so we have to ask ourselves how to deal with such a crisis, or generally with crisis on financial markets. And I will take a focus on crisis alpha of CTAs, commodity trading advisors, or managed futures. In a few slides, I will have some words on what that is exactly. But before that, I have to mention that the research that we did is funded by the European Union. So that's done. So let's come to the fun now. Well, usually I like to start my presentations with a nice quote. The quote that I have for you is something that's related to crises, or how to weather a crisis, a financial storm. Because if we talk about weathering financial storms, we are basically talking about diversification, right? And I have a very nice one from Shakespeare. Shakespeare always fits, I guess, from the Merchant of Venice. So my ventures are not in one bottom trusted, nor to one place, nor is my whole estate upon the fortune of this present year. Therefore, my merchandise makes me not sad. So diversification is a key component in mastering crises. And in fact, actually Shakespeare was not the first one who was into diversification. I have in my course material, my textbook for the students, a fantastic book, by the way. I've collected some other quotes that even go a little bit further back into history. And the oldest one actually that I found was from the Holy Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes, around 935 before Christ. But divide your investments among many places, for you do not know what risks might lie ahead. So that's about diversification, about correlation. Diversification is basically a question of correlations. And we are talking about CTAs. CTAs belong to the class of so-called alternative investments. Alternative investments are everything that's beyond taking long positions in the classical investment vehicles like equity, bonds, and cash. I show you on this slide some correlations between selected asset classes. That's until 2014, but it still holds. I was just too lazy to update the figure. So you see there, the dark gray ones are the classical investments. And I take large cap stocks from the US as a reference. And the light gray bars are different alternative investments. We see that hedge funds still have a comparatively high correlation with classical stock markets, classical equity investments. Managed futures, which is basically another word for CTAs, for commodity trading advisors, has a very low one. So that seems to be a good candidate for diversification. However, what we also know from literature is that correlation usually in times of crisis goes up. So you lose quite a lot of your benefit, of your diversification benefit during a crisis. Managed futures claim it's not the case for them. So they claim they can produce something which they call a crisis alpha, so outperformance during times of crises. And that means that obviously their benefit goes a little bit beyond just a pure diversification in terms of low correlation. So obviously they seem to do something right during times of crisis. Not everybody might agree to that. Burton Malkiel, with his famous book, Random Walk Down Wall Street, what he said was, or what he suggests is a blindfolded monkey throwing darts at the newspaper financial pages could select a portfolio that would do just as well as one carefully selected by the experts. So we are basically dealing with the question whether a monkey manager could do as well as a money manager. I don't know whether you know the left one, that's Lusha, a circus monkey from Moscow who some years ago in a competition, in kind of an investment game, has beaten 94% of the Russian investment managers. So it was a very successful manager, but I have to admit that the competition wasn't really fair. But even if such games of letting animals or monkeys play against human managers doesn't make a lot of sense, it still covers a core question of the financial industry, namely whether financial managers, money managers, have some skills that give them a superior contribution to existing portfolios, either by better diversification, as the CTAs claim, or by providing excess profit. So we are talking about commodity trading advisors, managed futures, just because they claim they would be able to provide such a crisis alpha. Managed futures is basically an investment vehicle managers that take positions, mostly in futures markets, on different asset classes. So to a large extent, of course, in equity, but also in precious metals, gold, currencies, debt, whatever. And they have gained a lot of importance during the last decades. So you see here that the assets under management increased from early 90s, around $10 billion, to more than $300 billion nowadays. They are trend followers, which makes them a little bit different from hedge funds. Also, very often they are seen as a special kind of hedge fund, but in effect, they don't like to hear that. What's the difference between a normal hedge fund and a CTA? Well, hedge funds usually take a relative value position, so they construct a almost zero cost portfolio by going short and long in the same asset class at the same time. Whereas CTAs usually take long or short positions, so they are betting on trends and they profit from directional market movements. Or if you would like to transfer that to financial anomalies, hedge funds try to exploit mostly try to exploit cross-sectional momentum, whereas CTAs typically try to exploit time series momentum, in other words, trends. So that's what a normal, typical hedge fund would do. If you have, for example, if you take a look at the shares of Apple and Google, they look at which one is currently overvalued, which is undervalued. So they go short in the overvalued one, long the undervalued one. I will finish that slide immediately because that's not what we are looking at. We are looking at managed futures, commodity trading advisors, and they try to follow trends, which they can do in very different ways. Very simple kind of such a trend following system would be what we typically know from technical analysis, a dual moving average crossover strategy. So you have two different moving averages and you take a long position whenever the short-term moving average is above the long-term moving average. You see that during a sidewards trend, you get a lot of noisy signals. So you create what's called whipsaw losses. You lose money by getting wrong signals from your system. And then at one point you get a buy signal, you invest in the trend, but you always leave the trend too late. So you experience some kind of what's called a give back loss because the signal generating function is a little bit sticky. And it's always a trade-off between whipsaw losses and give back losses. If you want to react very quickly, you will always create lots of whipsaw losses, lots of wrong signals, or you have to accept a delay in your decisions. So that's the difference between hedge funds and managed futures in comparison. So what do we know about CTAs? There has been some work on CTAs and financial crises, but the problem is that most of those papers that have been written on the crisis alpha of CTAs has focused on one or maybe very few individual crises. For example, there is this paper by Cretan Skelly on the LTCM and the Russian crisis and the equity bubble crisis of 2001. So that's what's lacking in many of the papers. It starts with the definition of a crisis. It's very often some kind of anecdotic evidence for a crisis. So what's usually has been in the public, in the media, been defined as crisis, that's taken as a crisis. But it becomes more difficult if you want to do a systematic analysis on the crisis timing abilities of CTAs. So the first point that we have to start with actually is how to detect crisis. So we need some kind of an objective method, an algorithm to detect crises. I write here both papers because actually we have two papers on very similar topics. One was actually on market timing abilities. That's what I'm not going to present here, but because that's already published in the International Review of Finance. What I'm talking about is the second part, which is ongoing research, where we are just working on. We did that together with RPM, Risk and Portfolio Management in Stockholm, which is a fund of funds that's specialized in managed futures. So exactly what we what we need. So they provided us with the data, of course, on an anonymous basis. So we couldn't identify individual traders, but very detailed data. And what may be even more important is that it's realized returns. So what they can observe on their account instead of just being reported to a database. We know from the literature that there may be some problems with reported returns of hedge funds and CTAs because they try to smooth the returns. So you see we have some data. That's RPM provided us with some index data. They have their own index. And you see from the correlations, it's very close to other indices that you have on this market segments. Paper, the name of the paper is a little bit different from the name of the presentation. It's called The Crisis Alpha of CTAs, Myth or Reality. And that's a joint work with Alexander Mender, good friend and former fellow PhD student of mine when we were both working in Germany, and Rahel Asif, who's a current PhD student of mine. He's graduating next year. So what's the main problem? Took another quote from a book on trend following, and the main statement is that the key to finding true diversification is in finding an investment that's able to deliver performance during these turbulent periods. We are now also experiencing a very turbulent period. And CTAs often use that as a sales argument. What they use as a sales argument is easy to see in this figure. So all the gray, the shadowed regions are bull markets. So we have trends upwards, and the green, the blue line is the stock market index, the Russell 3000. You can also use any other stock market index. The figure will look more or less the same. And the green line is a CTA index. So you see that in the long run, CTA index outperforms the stock market, which does not necessarily need to be the case. And that's also not what's important. But if you take a look at some of those declines on the stock market in the right regions, you see that the stock market substantially declines. So that was, for example, the Lehman Brothers crisis. You also have the long crisis after the burst of the dot-com bubble around the turn of the century. Whereas the CTAs, and they mostly gained attention during the Lehman Brothers crisis, when they earned positive returns. So that actually, if that holds, if that's a systematic property of those investment vehicles, that means that it would be a perfect insurance against losses during crises. And in other words, they provide what they call themselves the crisis alpha. And our aim is to check whether that crisis alpha really exists. And in a second step, where does it come from? So it may come from good diversification, of course, if those CTAs are during crisis invested in markets that provide positive returns, let's say precious metals, gold, whatever. Or is it because they anticipate? Can they forecast a crisis? Or do they just react very quickly? We try to answer those two questions. As a tool for that, we first need a classification algorithm. I will do that, well, actually quite quickly because it's a more technical issue. Just want to mention some of the problems that you face when you want to do that. Well, as mentioned, many papers just use a very simple definition of a crisis. There are a couple of classification algorithms who do that on an automated basis. Most of them, however, work on classifying bull versus bear markets. So trends upwards versus trend downwards. Crisis versus non-crisis is a little bit different. So what defines a crisis? First, we need to get an idea about what a crisis is. A crisis, in many cases, is defined just as a market decline by a certain percentage. In fact, that's not enough, because we also have to take into account the speed at which that happens. So if a market declines by, let's say, 5% over a year, that may be normal for some of the markets. It's quite untypical for stock markets, but for some other markets like energy or currency markets, that's not unusual. If the price declines over 5% within 5 days, that makes a difference. So both the duration of the price decline and the size, the magnitude of the decrease in the price, both take a role. So we have to take both into consideration. And that's actually what we did. Our analysis is based on algorithm suggested by Lünde and Timmermann, who actually just work with the magnitude. So they define well, actually, they do not look at crisis, they look at bull and bear markets. They define, for example, a bull market as a price increase of 10 to 15% over the previous low. And they define a bear market as a price decline of 15 to 20% over the previous high. What we did, and I will skip a couple of slides because that would probably lead too far. If anybody is interested in the technical details, just contact me. I can, of course, send you the paper. What we do is we define something that we call an intensity factor that takes into account both the magnitude of the price change and the duration of the price change. So the shorter and the more severe the price change is, the more we are able to call that a crisis. And at the first step, then we have to go one step further. We have to define those thresholds. And we do this by applying well, actually quite old algorithm, which nevertheless find very interesting. So if you have a price series like this, it actually starts by deleting all the points where no price change occurs, then deletes all the points where actually the trend doesn't change. So if you have two subsequent price increases, you can delete one and still in the essence, you know what happened, nothing changes. And then you start sorting all the price changes from small to large. So you get an ordered list of trends, and that's what you can use by thresholds. So what we did was we looked at the most severe 1% trends and combined that with the duration. And so finally, we got a crisis identification. I will show you the identified. I will skip through some of the slides. So that would be for bull and bear market. So you see for equity, fixed income, you get very different thresholds. We also added some extra constraints, like for crisis, you should have a strong decline with a rebound that's smaller than the decline that has happened before. And then finally, we end up with the definition of crises, which you see in the slide at the example of the equity market. So you see that all the price declines and crises that we observed in the market are found back. But the advantage is that we have a very objective way now to do that. So if anybody else does the same, applies the same algorithm to the same data, we would get the same results. It depends, of course, on the history of each series, which needs to be the case because, for example, on bond markets, a crisis, of course, has a very different meaning than on equity markets. Price changes on bond markets are generally smaller. So, of course, also what you would call a crisis on the bond market would be a normal price movement on the equity market. So that's why we need to make that market dependent. So let's also skip that one. We see that many crises on different markets. So you see the markets that we looked at: stocks, bonds, commodities, different kinds of commodities, agricultural, energy, metals, which we later even split up into precious and non-precious metals, and currencies, that many of the crises happen at the same time. That makes it difficult for diversification, of course. So is there such a crisis alpha? Now that we have the crises, we can see how the market performed during those periods and how our various CTA indices performed. So we see the market performance during the crisis for the different markets in this column. Interestingly, precious metals increased, and trade-weighted currencies or trade-weighted exchange rates on emerging markets for smaller currencies also increased. Why is that the case? Because we have a slightly different understanding of a crisis. We are not looking at a crisis on the market or crisis in the market. We are looking at the impact of a crisis on a particular market. So during a crisis like COVID-19, if you look back at the price of gold, for example, you will find that the price of gold has substantially increased over the last year. Same with the value of the currencies of major countries, US dollar and other reserve currencies relative to emerging markets. So precious metals and currencies versus emerging market currencies play a special role because they reflect during a crisis an increase. So you can observe an increase in price during a crisis on those markets because they serve as a safe haven. For all the other markets, we see what we intuitively understand as a crisis, a strong market decline. And we see that for all of the markets for which we observe that, managed futures have performed much better than the market itself. So indeed, there seems to be some kind of a crisis alpha. We confirmed that by a version of the Henriksen and Merton test, which is originally a test for market timing abilities, but you can adapt that to our question as well. And we see that for all of the markets, we get the correct sign, significant for the most important ones. Energy, agricultural commodities, and industrial metals are relatively small markets, which are less important for the total portfolio of managed futures. So in all the important markets, we find significant crisis timing abilities. Now, the next question would be, how do they do that? So diversification is one point, we already saw that. What about anticipation versus reaction speed? This figure shows you the exposure of CTAs to the equity market, and the shadowed regions are crisis periods. So you see that the exposure always decreases during crisis periods. So that seems to play a role as well, and we can look a little bit closer into that. So to say, from the bird's eye to the microscope, let's take a look at what happens during a crisis. So we did this in following kind of an event study. So this line is the start of the crisis. So the average of all crises that we found. How does the market react? So we have this line in the middle and a confidence interval. And we can observe that before the crisis starts, there are high capital gains, what we would expect. And all the cumulative returns erode after the start of the crisis and have reached about around zero after more or less 30 days on average. And then it stabilizes at around cumulative negative return, cumulative loss of 10% after around 90 days, so after around 3 months. That's how it looks like for the CTAs, for the CTA index. So again, we see that cumulative returns increase before the crisis, but to a much lesser extent than the market. But after that, it pretty quickly stabilizes. And when the market as a whole stabilizes, they start gaining profits. So that's a huge difference between the return profile of the whole market during a crisis and the return profile of CTAs during a crisis. It looks even stronger if you just take the subset of CTAs that claim to be trend followers. You would expect that they are particularly good in doing that. And indeed, you find that they earn higher returns already before the crisis. And they, their cumulative returns are higher throughout the whole observation window, and they increase faster and higher after the stabilization. So how do they do that? Well, they basically do that by very quickly adjusting to the new situation. So you see that the sector position, equity sector position, so how much are our CTAs invested in the equity market? So you see that the exposure, the sector position increases before the crisis, which means that they do not forecast the crisis. They don't know that. They still invest more and more in the market. But when the crisis starts, they very, very quickly reduce their sector position and even get a negative one. And only when the market has stabilized after around 90 days, they build up a positive sector position again. And you see how their sector position very nicely corresponds with their cumulative returns that they earn. So what we can conclude is that managed futures at CTAs at the same time profit from diversification, but even to a higher extent, they profit from their very high adjustment speed. And the next natural question, of course, is how did they perform in 2020? So that's the performance both indexed at 100 in the beginning of the equity market, the MSCI World, and the one of the CTA indices. So we see that the CTA indices hardly moves, whereas the market actually had this huge decline in spring this year, and the two smaller ones in fall, with a quick recovery in between. So what can we conclude from that? First of all, with a investment in the CTA index, exclusively in the CTA index, you wouldn't have earned money. You would have been, over the whole year, you would have been better off with investing in the market itself. Why is that the case? Well, from what we have seen on the previous slides, we see that, well, CTAs react quite quickly, but it was also a very rapid decline in prices. And in fact, the ideal crisis for a CTA would be a long-lasting, a slow decline, which gives the which gives the CTA time to adjust the position and then be invested, time to bet on the long decline. It still takes a while to get adjusted to a trend break for a CTA. So that quick decline was probably too fast. CTAs are also certainly nothing that you would consider as a standalone investment. They are rather considered to be a good add-on to your portfolio. So if you had, for example, mixed passive investment in the market with the CTA, you would get the yellow line. So you see, it's a good, it might be a good tool to flatten the volatility of the whole portfolio. What we conclude therefore is, first, CTAs do have market timing ability, crisis timing abilities. They can provide a positive alpha during crisis periods, but that's not for free. You pay that by losing returns during normal market periods, as we have seen in the second half of this year. But they can add as an add-on, as a component of your portfolio that lowers dependence, your exposure to the crisis. Okay, so that's what I wanted to let you know about my our research that we did on that question. If you're interested in the whole paper, just let me know. You see my email here. Send me an email. I will be happy to send you the paper and discuss the results of our research with you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here.
Professor Frommel, thank you very much for your exceptional presentation. Once again, we would like to thank to all keynote speakers and all conference participants, but also the conference and organizing committee for bringing all of us together at this year's conference. Now, let's get started with the discussion. As we can see on the chat, there are some questions, actually 4 questions for Professor Mers. Professor Mers, would you please answer the question? Just to say that questions were asked Professor Goran Pitic, Marko Slavkovic, Professor Saša Bradović, and Andrija Popović. Professor Mers.
So I'm just looking at the chat function and just want to orientate. Does this mean, I'm going with the question from Goran Pitic at 9:39, does this mean that at today's macro uncertainty caused by COVID, companies should seek for more formalization or should consider it as a temporary, irregular uncertainty? Well, that's a good question. And I think that this is what the first slide that I put up, where I looked at the news, and I think all of us back in February, March time had no idea that this crisis of the impact of COVID-19 would be so volatile and be so global and long-term. And of course, we all have the hope that the vaccine may make a change and that eventually life will become, well, different. I mean, people talk about the new normal, and this is, of course, a difficult thing to imagine. What will be the new normal? So when you say a temporary, irregular uncertainty, I might have to go with Mark Kearney on this, who is recently done the Wreath Lectures in London. And he said there are 3 crises: credit, COVID, climate. And so I think we need to look at those joined together and really think through what we can do as individuals, as organizations, and as governments. Not look at it as an isolated incident. And when I say formalization, what our research mainly shows is that if there is a huge amount of uncertainty at government level, for instance, in the implementation of a scheme to help people survive, like in the UK, that was the furlough system, and in every country there are different systems. What can organizations do in order to make sure that people still engage in organizational citizenship behavior? Well, one of the things that they can do is just clarify the rules and the regulations about hiring and firing people, and not be volatile and have knee-jerk reactions. So, and this then drives the point that for organizations and for governments and us as individuals, and I think this is reflected in all of the keynote speeches today, evidence, data, information, sharing information is hugely important. And therefore it needs to go beyond this wonderful conference, and we need to reach to those who are practitioners. So that is my answer to the first question. I don't know if you want me to address all of them.
Okay.
I think they are in a similar vein. One question is quite practical from Marko Slavkovic, how to provide more formalization in work from home. Remember that formalization is not setting up some camera to see what people are doing at home. Then it becomes micromanagement and coercive. It is about just being very clear about role expectations. What are people expected to do? Formal procedures can also be, please don't work at the weekend, or you are not expected to pick up every text message or WhatsApp message or your email at 2 o'clock in the morning. And you see that more and more often, that people put in their signature, I may send a message at so-and-so out of office times, but you are not expected to reply. So it's about setting expectations so that people understand what is acceptable and familiar within this environment. Then the question is, can the formalized procedure and rules be an obstacle to firm growth? Again, if uncertainty is reduced, then formalization can actually be an obstruction, because people will, in more certain times, have the cognitive bandwidth and don't have to worry about survival. And therefore, formalization, the rules and regulations, which then may become more bureaucratic, can actually obstruct. But again, remember what Mark Carney said, we need clarity about how we engage with risk and the values of tomorrow, which is related to credit, COVID, and climate. And then the final question from Andreas Popovic, wouldn't higher levels of formalization within companies cause disarray due to erratic and unpredictable measures related to the higher levels of uncertainty caused by the COVID-19 on the national level? Well, this is where I think what you're arguing, which is a very good point, is that we are seeing in 2020 that people are constantly shifting the goalposts, and ironically, some of that is based on the evidence and that is coming out again and again, where governments have new regulations and therefore organizations need to be incredibly agile in terms of how they respond to the changing of the goalposts, so to speak. So again, it is how you translate formalization and those rules and those procedures, and how they can actually be helpful instead of being obstructive. And that is certainly something for further discussion, I think. So I hope that these comments very briefly help. I know we are having limited time in terms of our discussion.
Professor Mers, thank you very much for your answers. Now we have one comment and two questions, I think, for Professor Gestel. Professor Gestel, would you please answer the question or give your comment?
Yeah, I think the people are interested in this idea about the end of accounting and how accounting should deal with the new economy, where research and development and brand building is, of course, very important. And we saw this in the COVID, the case of the COVID vaccine. The stock market reacted, very strongly to the good news about the vaccine when it was released, I guess, in November. And the question is, how can financial statements and accounting reports produce valuable information about such things? And I think we have to be clear on the limitations of accounting in that that regard. I think that's a very good illustration of the logic of the conceptual framework. Of course, for many companies, the results of research and development activities are, really very important. Probably, in the pharmaceutical industry, of course, that's what they are doing. But on the other hand, we cannot. I don't think it's good to include too much, soft information, right, in the financial statements. The companies may be very optimistic about the results of their research and development, but just putting that in a report, that's not the kind of reliable information that I think the financial statements are for. So the idea of kind of trying to value research and development and introducing those numbers in the financial statement, that's not a good idea. And that has to be done in a different way. So definitely non-financial information would be important. Testing of other medications, that's obviously good news, but that's not for the financial statements. That must be devised in a different way. So there was a question here about the yeah, and I think that was the main issue that was raised. So was there anything else that I forgot? I can.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Gestel, for your answers. Now we have 2 questions for Professor Frommel from Vladimir Mihailovic and Mirjana Todorovic. Professor Frommel, would you please answer the questions?
Yes, indeed I see 3 questions. There was also one by Mirjana Todorovic in the beginning. Who refers to one figure in the presentation. So maybe it's good if I just share my screen again for this figure. I think you're talking about this figure, right? Now the chat is gone and I don't see the question any longer. Okay, here it's back. So about gold, gold and bonds. Some say government bonds or even gold can act as a safe haven when equity markets decreases. This is somewhat different from what you showed in the graph at the beginning of your presentation. I don't think it's different. Gold is missing in this list, in this figure, but it would certainly be located somewhere here in the right region. If you talk about bonds, global bonds have a correlation with large US stocks, 0.23, which is still quite low. So that's still quite a good safe haven, a good diversification. You also have to take into account that this is about global bonds. So that may include bonds, government bonds from emerging countries, which are during the crisis, of course, more vulnerable. I think if you restrict yourself to bonds of top issuers, the correlation would even be lower. So I still believe that's a good addition to the portfolio. Gold, as you mentioned as well. Currencies, we have seen in our research that it's some currencies that are a good hedge then, namely hard currencies, US dollar, euro, whatever. So yes, so it's good to have a little bit of all of those components in your portfolio. Next question was about probability for systemic financial crisis due to pandemic. I'm not that pessimistic actually about that. We have seen that we had this very huge decline in the spring, and after that, markets reacted much less to news. And it's a little bit the same as with, I know has been some research on impact on terrorism. That with time, the impact of terrorist attacks on financial markets became less and less. So financial markets also tend to get a little bit used to that. We also saw that, I mean, this pandemic is not the only macro risk that we have in the market. We had the US election which is now solved. We immediately saw the reaction on that. We now have the Brexit to do. If there would be a solution for that, that would be a further stabilization of the market. And I guess next year we will have significant progress in fighting the pandemic. And finally, there was a last question on whether volatility itself can be a signal for market crisis. Yes, indeed, you see that also in this figure. Volatility has a very high negative correlation with stock markets in general. Volatility is in tendency higher when you have a decline in stock prices. So, and that also relates to the first question. Derivatives on volatility, on a volatility index, can also be a good contribution to lower the risk of your portfolio. However, the more insurances you add to your portfolio against losses, the less return you will on average earn during good periods. That's also something that you have to take into account. And of course, volatility only is a good sign of a crisis, but it's not a good predictor, because volatility starts with the crisis. It starts increasing with the crisis, not before that. So you can not use that for predicting crisis, but you could also use that as a hedge against crisis. Hope the questions are answered.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Frommel, for your answers. Is there anyone else in the audience who would like to share some impressions with us? Professor Mollet, please.
I'm going to report on the work on socially responsible society, including at the moment 35 people, including 5 from Kragujevac. And I would like to ask all 3 speakers, how do they use the ISO standards in their work? We are concentrating on ISO 26000 standards on social responsibility especially. Thank you.
Okay. Who would like to answer this question? Do we have answer on this question?
Well,
Professor Frommel.
not a very specific answer to the ISO standard. But I would like to add something more general to socially responsible investments. We have also done a little bit research on that. Or actually, I'm just refreshing this research together with a PhD student of mine, and that's on socially responsible investments in on emerging economies. We know that it's becoming more and more important in emerging economies. I've had one Vietnamese student last year who graduated last year, who was working on socially responsible investments in East Asia. And it's very impressive how this idea is now spreading around the world. What we found when we did our research on socially responsible investments, profitability of socially responsible investments in emerging economies, was that it doesn't give you an extra profit. You know, there are some different competing hypotheses that you earn extra profits from socially responsible investments on the one hand, on the other hand that you have to pay for that. But in fact, what we found is that actually it doesn't really matter for your returns whether you do socially responsible investments. But of course, you have other benefits from that besides pure returns. So not working, because I'm not working on accountancy with those particular standards, but more interested in how does that affect your portfolio value. And we actually found that you can socially responsibly invest without any loss in your return, at least, with the other benefits that you have besides that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I say a few words about answer the question? Can you hear me?
Professor Gestel, of course.
Yes. So yeah. So I know that environmental and socially responsible investment is a very hot topic, and colleagues of mine are working on that issue in the finance department as well as in the accounting department. I'm not doing so personally, but I think it's very important to get in place a very good system for reporting on the risks involved in this kind of investment. So people want to do a socially responsible investment, but what are the good opportunities? What are the companies doing? What are the risks in that area? You know, what is the risk to the company from the climate crisis and so on. So as I was mentioning in my talk briefly, you know, this is something that we have to solve. There has to be some standards. You know, there has to be a good way of reporting these opportunities and risks. And at the moment, I think this is not satisfactory, and there definitely needs some rules and standards for how this is being done. And there seems to be many organizations that want to participate, want to help us to get this a good system of reporting, but you know, it can't be 10 or 20 different standards. There has to be one that everybody is supposed to follow. So the interesting thing going forward is to figure out, you know, who's going to do this job to make the standards and tell the companies how to report on these very important issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Molloy, for an interesting question, and thank to all keynote speakers for their answers. Now the plenary session.
Can I have a response also from the lady, from the first speaker?
Okay, Professor Mers, would you like to answer the question?
Uncertainty and standards, that's something which is very much completing each other.
The lady will respond. I think that the comment of Professor Gestal is important, is if you set standards, it's going to often be culturally subjective. Even the Universal Declaration of Human Rights creates arguments among people across the globe. And this is because we are from certain environments that are driven by different values. We can try to agree what is the best for the planet and base this on science. However, there will always be culturally subjective interpretations of what is the best way forward. And so this is a dialogue that may take some time. And we need to understand that there is not necessarily a Greenwich Mean Time behavior in management and governance. There is nothing that is neutral. And therefore, the interpretations of even science, sad as it may be, and then how that is communicated is important. So even if you have agreed on one standard, the next step then is, how do you communicate that to specific audiences?
Okay, thank you. I suppose that now I can tell that the plenary session is completed, and we will have a short break. After the break, we will continue according to the conference program. At the end of this session, we would like to wish you good health and all the best in the next year. Also, we hope to see you all again here at the Faculty of Economics, University of Kragujevac, at our 7th EBM conference in 2 years. Finally, I kindly ask you to turn on your cameras so we can take a photo all together. Thank you very much.
How long is the break? Until 1:30?
Sorry, about 50 minutes.
15.
And we'll start with parallel session then.
Okay. My co-host, Miro Miches, didn't get the link.
Okay, we will send him.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So we have to switch now, right, to the other.
Thank you very much again, and see you at parallel sessions. Yes, you should start with a link on a parallel session, key issues in management and marketing. You can enter. Nisam ga čula što pitanje.